10 Commandments for Character, right?
Right.
And he's particularly proud of that one, especially in this day and age right now where it seems like we are in an epidemic of poor character. And it's not a coincidence that I put that in the thumbnail. But how are you today, Dr.
I'm
Simon?
great. Thank you very much. And thanks for having me on, Jared.
My pleasure.
Happy to be with you again.
It's only been, I guess it's a little over a year now, but the time does fly, doesn't it?
Yeah, it sure does.
Absolutely. So what do you think about that, this epidemic of poor character that we're in? I mean, you did something about it by writing the book, but what are your thoughts?
Well, we've been in a vicious cycle of sorts for several decades now. You know, human beings don't come by character naturally. We're born basically uncivilized, and we are as creatures, we take longer to socialize than any other creatures there are. It's a, day by day, minute by minute, year by year, for many, many years to properly socialize us.
Right.
And I know people in their 60s who are just now getting it,
So it's never too late, you're saying.
Right. So it's always been a challenging process. But over the past several decades, we've been in a vicious cycle, whereas some of the elements of our environment that help shape and forge character have become corrupted and deteriorated and become less effective. And in that process, more and more character impaired people emerged on the scene. And as that happened, as more and more character impaired people populated the society and prospered in the society, the atmosphere got further corrupted. It's a vicious cycle,
Right.
one feeding the other.
How do we even begin the process of turning it around? Because at this very moment, it seems almost hopeless, honestly. It seems like we're worse off right now than we've ever been in America, outside of the Civil War, perhaps.
Well, let me first say how we can't do it. And this is what people are trying to do. You can't do it by basically telling others how misguided they are, how silly they are, how stupid they are, how much righter you are, how superior your perspective is to theirs, and presenting all kinds of facts and figures to back it up, because you're only going to invite backlash. That isn't how we're going to do it. The only way that history has shown, the only way that it works is one heart at a time, beginning with ours. And that's really the point that I try to emphasize in Essentials for the Journey. Wholesomeness is attractive. People know when they're in the presence of wholesomeness, and the impact is almost automatic. We're hardwired for that. So that's how we're going to do it, one heart at a time, beginning with our own. And I'm not the first psychologist to be saying this, or the first sociologist or anybody else. And history speaks to that. History speaks to that very well. But that's how we've got to do it.
I think what happens is people get discouraged. They get discouraged because it seems like there's so many people that have black and white thinking. They can't hear an opinion they disagree with without getting really upset and announcing their departure. I got to unfollow you. You said one thing I didn't agree with. Right. And like in that climate, to me, that's what contributes to the just discouraging atmosphere. And I personally, honesty is number one to me. And that's one of your 10 commandments of character is honesty. And if people can't tolerate our honesty, it's like, what do we do?
Right. You know, one of the 10 commandments that I have for therapy and for therapists working with character disturbances, therapists tend to make the same mistake that people in relationships with disturbed characters make. We know that how we think about things, our attitudes, etc., influences our behavior, and heavily so. That's the heart of the cognitive behavioral framework within which most psychologists and mental health professionals operate these days. But here's the trick. What we mostly do, which is an error, it's a significant error, is we try to reason with people. We try to convince them that the way they're seeing things and doing things isn't good and that they should try a different way in hopes that their behavior will change. The two are connected. Behavior and attitudes and ways of thinking, they're connected, but you don't change behavior through reason. Mental processes and reason changes with a change in behavior. We learn by experience. That's how we got in this mess in the first place. We were misshaped, if you will, by the toxic environment, and we're realizing the fruits of that. So, in the right here, right now realm of a therapeutic encounter, what we really want to do is invite people to try a different way of relating, and then to reinforce that and let them experience the rewards of that. That's the best teacher. So, whenever I'm called in as a consultant for therapists who are struggling, let's say they've got a narcissistic client or they've got an abusive relationship they're trying to work with, I'm absolutely appalled as I witness the same thing that the person who came into therapy has been complaining about happening right then and right there in the therapist's office. The impression management, the subtle put downs, the blaming others, that it all goes on right there. I thought, well, how is anything going to change if it's being reinforced right here and right now?
Right.
Not going to change.
And that's the big thing now too. We mentioned this before we turned this on, but poor character seems to be rewarded right now more than ever. And I see it like Conor McGregor, for example. I'm not sure if you know who that is, but he's a popular example of it, where he has learned to talk trash in a way that's made him one of the richest fighters out there. And so,
Mhm.
low character, he just says whatever you need to say to
Right.
promote a fight. Doesn't matter right, wrong, who you insult, who you put down, but people love it
Right.
because it's entertaining. And that's, I think, a big thing. Like, the darker forces are often entertaining and charismatic and confident. And you
Yep.
see this in dating, you see this with money issues, but it's like, how do you get people to see through that?
Well, and once again, that's a dead end street. Trying to get people to see.
Yeah.
I have little rhyming phrases that I used to use in workshops. I would say the problem is not so much that they don't see. Probably there's nothing you can say that somebody hasn't mentioned to them 1,000 times in 1,000 different ways over the course of their lifetime. So the problem is not that they don't see, they see fine. They see, but they actually disagree with what you're trying to say and what you're advocating because it's proven not to be rewarding to them. They're getting by just fine. Society seems to reinforce everything they're doing and the way they're doing it. So why should they agree? Why should they? Where's their motivation, basically, to change?
Right. As I was saying, where is it? Where is the motivation?
So stop wasting your time and your energy trying to get anybody to see what they already see. Let's work on the disagreements. Let's see if we can find one little something, one little somewhere to start building a healthier relationship.
I can see. I mean, and that's all we can do. One small
Right.
piece at a time,
One small
one
piece at a
small step at a time. And the little things matter.
Right.
The
And
little
that's how we
things
got
matter.
in this mess slowly, incrementally, over time. Whereas people who wouldn't have fit, they wouldn't have been a good fit for the social order decades ago, are lauded today,
Right.
right? So we have to turn it away around the same way we got here, incrementally, one heart at a time, beginning with our own. I'll sound like a broken record on that,
And
probably.
that takes patience. That takes patience,
And commitment.
honesty,
And
commitment, humility. Patience is another one that I think is very in a shortage of patience right now.
in an atmosphere of instant gratification, go figure.
Yeah, yeah. So there's a lot of things going against us, but I don't think it's impossible, but it
Yeah,
does feel that way sometimes.
right. Right. I mentioned that in Essentials for the Journey. Our environments have a lot to do with things. And, young folks in increasing numbers are medicated so that they can study in school and pay attention in school. And, we bombard them 24 hours, 7 days a week with high rate, high stimulation, instant gratification kinds of stimuli, right? And then we put them in an environment where the rewards are distant, where it's kind of boring. There's not instant gratification like that, and then we expect them to focus.
Right.
My goodness.
Well, do you think young boys do need to be taught a little bit differently than like maybe girls would?
I years ago I might have said yes. I think the gender differences are fading quite a bit.
Okay.
Yeah, behaviors that I would have never thought that I would see commonplace in young ladies are much more commonplace than I ever would have imagined.
Yeah. I mean, people are changing. Things are absolutely changing,
Yeah,
and the changes between the sexes is no exception to that.
yeah.
Um, Another thing I wanted to ask you, like the genetic component of narcissism, of character disorder, what are your thoughts on that?
Okay. Well, we know, years and years and years ago, we already knew from twins reared apart, studies of twins reared apart, that there was some genetic loading for certain traits. The two most reliable traits was one was the predisposition toward schizophrenia. We knew that there was a heavy genetic loading there because twins reared in radically different environments still had a predisposition for developing the disease. The other one was the key trait involved in psychopathy, which is empathy deficiency, a diminished capacity for empathy. Now, empathy is one of those things that has to be nurtured anyway. And you can also put somebody in an environment that is so abusive and so toxic that you help numb them and basically teach them it doesn't pay to care, you know. But we do know that empathy deficiency has a heavy biological loading. So that trait is a part of several different character disturbances, narcissism included.
Right. And because that's been the hot topic recently.
Yeah,
There's been the debate of, well, is trauma causing these disorders of narcissism, borderline,
right.
or is it more of the genetic component? And people
Yeah,
are coming around to the genetic component piece.
right. You know, we the thing that really bothers me the most about the research and the things that we think we learn. I'll give you a perfect example. Several years ago, some very convincing studies came out that showed that the brains of psychopaths work very, very differently from normal individuals. You present them with certain stimuli that normally evoke responses in the areas of the brain associated with emotion, etc., and the connection is just not there. Now, from that result, however, interpretations were made that just boggle the mind. I'm a scientist. I agree with science, but what has happened to science has happened to all fields, and that is corruption. When you have an experimental result, you're duty bound to the field not to overinterpret your results. We don't know from those studies that those brains were wired differently from birth. We don't know that. That's a
Hmm.
false interpretation. It's not logical. But these are the kinds of interpretations we make all the time.
So that's one you disagree with. That
Well, no, I don't disagree. I agree with the finding. The
okay?
finding says the brains work differently. Now, how that came to be, given as plastic as we know the brain to be, we don't know the answer to that.
That's fair.
So
That's
you
fair.
can't say they're born different.
So you're saying
Now,
it could
they
right.
may be, but you can't say that based on that evidence.
Okay. I guess maybe the twin studies are what people emphasize with the from birth thing, or it's
Well, we
something
know that
innate.
the deficiency trait is there. That's correct. Now, how serious that is, how amenable that person is to certain coaching and development. Like I said, the brain is an amazingly plastic influence. And just because there's some genetic loading, we know, for example, that there are certain genetic loads for certain kinds of cancers. But there are also some things you can do,
Right.
right, to improve your odds of surviving a little longer or maybe
Sure.
even not succumbing.
Right.
So there's so much we don't know. And if there's anything we need in the sciences, it's a little humility to say, we think we know some things, but you know what? we, we're novices in this. I can't tell you the number of things that I was taught in school just 50 years ago that would be regarded as preposterous today.
What's an example of something like that?
An example would be that autism was the result of cold mothers nursing their children.
Hmm.
That was taught. And
And
now,
now, what do they believe? Is genetic?
well, there's a heavy developmental loading. Whether it's all genetic, we don't know. Whether there's some influence of trauma in utero or even in early development, we don't know. But we do know that there's a heavy biological loading of some kind. We know that.
Right. I mean, and more than likely, like you said, with neuroplasticity being a thing, it's a tandem. Like there's going to be, for some things, the genetic component might be more,
That's
but
right.
then you can't say that the environment is zero.
Right.
Like they're going to work in tandem, I would say. And
Right.
imagine if they didn't. If they didn't work in tandem at all, we wouldn't be seeing like some of the changes we can see in people.
Right.
So, and it can be oblique. It can be bleak sometimes too to think it's all just genetic.
Right.
But
And you asked the question in our earlier correspondence about narcissism. That's one of my peeves about all the information that's out there about narcissism. People talk about it like it's a one size fits all phenomenon, like cancer. Well, there are many different types of cancer. Some are relatively benign. Others are quite malignant, are highly viral. So when somebody talks about narcissism, I say, okay, what type are you talking about? How serious? You asked if there's any kind of good narcissism. And I, my answer to that is, by definition, narcissism is not a particularly healthy thing, but it does matter the type. And when I was first writing about this 30 years ago, there was no empirical evidence to support the notion that there were two major varieties. Now the evidence is pretty clear. There are two major varieties with very different etiologies or background forming kinds of things. If empathy deficiency right from the get go is there, that's a whole different kind of narcissism. If if indulging in parenting, if conferring of special status, attitudes of entitlement, all of that shapes a very, very different kind of narcissist from the more classic compensatory, vulnerable type who is making up for unconsciously some inner feelings of low self worth. You
right.
know, so It's always dangerous to paint with a broad brush, to overgeneralize. It's always risky and dangerous. But see, we like certainty. We like
Yep.
to we like to have some general rules that we think always apply. It makes the job easier.
Well, you know what happens. People, they want certainty. And then when someone comes and talks online, the more certain they sound,
Right,
especially about things that might be a little controversial,
right,
that builds a following.
right.
It builds a following, helps their business, and those undercurrents of capitalism plus sex drive stuff, they influence everything.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
So the other thing, when I was speaking to Dr. Salerno, he had made a good point, and he had said that when we talk about narcissism, we have to make sure we're working with the same definitions.
That's
Because,
correct.
like, what does someone mean when they say narcissism? So when I say narcissism to you, what do you mean when you say narcissism?
And once again, it would depend. It would depend. The full answer would depend on what type and how serious. But the core of narcissism is an unhealthy self-regard. And it usually manifests in some kind of egoic inflation, some kind of bent out of shape opinion of oneself. Um, so there are certain core elements there. But we get the term, it's a very interesting term. We get the term from an ancient Greek myth. There are two versions of this myth. Narcissus was this Greek god kind of good looking hunter or warrior type. He was basically a hunter, and he's the envy of all the nymphs. The nymphs are these mythical feminine creatures that love their heroes, and try to lure them, et cetera, et cetera. Well, Narcissus comes upon his reflection in a clear pond, and this is key. He falls in love not with himself, because it's not a disease to truly love yourself. He falls in love with his image, what's reflected back to him, the perfect image. And one thing that you'll see narcissists of almost every type do is this kind of impression management, where they care a lot about being seen a certain way. Whether it's compensatory or non-compensatory, they really are concerned about how you view them. The least pathological just want you to hold them in high regard. The most pathological want you to bow down and adore them, you know.
Sure.
But in the mythical story of Narcissus, this nymph is basically chasing after Narcissus, but he is completely unfazed. Usually, if you're a hero in Greek mythology, you're pretty flattered by the fact that the nymphs are chasing after you. Well, Narcissus has already found all that he needs
Oh, I got you.
in his own reflection, so he's not particularly interested
And
in
so
the nymphs.
you made some good points there too, because most people think when they hear the word narcissist, they think, oh, they must be overcompensating for some sort of vulnerability, or they must be trying to make up for some huge lack of self esteem. But you say, not always true. Not
Not
always true.
Yeah, that is the first major subtype of narcissist. You described that fairly accurately. But you can be overly indulged. You can be taught that you're special, that you're superior. You can be given all those kinds of messages, or you can actually have a predisposition to feel that way. Um, we just don't know enough. Regardless, the behavior pretty much tells you what you need to know. If you'll just observe behavior well enough, you can tell when a lack of empathy is there, when an inflated sense of self is there. And whether it's compensatory or not, it's not healthy. Which is why, again, I say what you do is you focus on the behavior, not what's underneath it. People used to always criticize the behavioral part of cognitive behavioral therapy, say, well, you can change behavior, but that doesn't change the insides. People will do what you now expect them to do or what they find rewarding, but they haven't really changed. They're just they're just modifying their act, so to speak. That can be true also. But, sometimes enough experience will change your outlook. I know so many experiences in life that have changed my outlook on everything, especially the art of therapy,
Sure. I
as
mean,
I was working with more and more character impaired people.
and wouldn't you want them to at least try? It's like, okay, you have this empathy deficiency, but wouldn't you want that person to try to change their behavior? And
Absolutely.
some people have mentioned this to me because I say, yeah, with narcissists in particular, they're not going to be able to feel empathy if they have that empathy deficiency there, but I think they can still try to act like behavior modification and
Right,
try to improve their behavior. And people were saying, well, isn't that them just being fake? Exactly what you just said
right,
about it. But it's like,
right,
well, wouldn't you still rather have them try, whether it's fake or not? Like, at least they would do less harm that way.
right. And it will also tell you, the experience will also tell you what you're dealing with. In other words, if you're trying your best to shape behavior and you're getting a lot of resistance, that tells you how deeply rooted some of the traits are that are influencing this behavior, whether they've been overlearned or whether it's part of the makeup. You get feedback from the person about how difficult the task this is. And I can tell you that when narcissism is combined with other traits, the picture gets very complicated. I say in all my books that some of the character disturbances that people are labeling these days narcissism go way beyond the narcissism involved. In other words, there's way more to the person's character makeup that's a problem than just their narcissism. So I have my own kind of scheme that I invent, that I present in all my books to help tease that out, not as a firm diagnostic formula, because I think all that's kind of pointless anyway, but as a way of explaining that what you're seeing here phenomenologically with somebody's character, there's more to it. There's more to this person than just their narcissism. That's a problem. For instance, I've seen, for example, folks who are on the autistic spectrum who have a biologically based, and this would do a discredit to anybody who's on on the autistic spectrum who doesn't have a character disturbance, but who's somebody who's on the spectrum and who also has a character disturbance, say narcissism, and of the more malignant kind. So a person who's already limited in their social understanding capacity, their ability to relate in a in an adaptive way socially, somebody who's already got a natural impairment there, and on top of it, they've got this trait or these traits, one of which inhibits their empathy and the other of which predisposes them to have this inflation. Uh, uh, well, they're a whole heck of a lot of a different hell to live with
Sure, sure.
than somebody else, and that's why these overly simplistic categories that we want to have to make us feel better, like we have all this understanding and we know the prognosis. We make these blanket statements. It's just it truly, as a scientist and as a human being, it breaks my heart. We're supposed to be, as scientists, natural skeptics. Every time we think we have something, we're supposed to say, that's very interesting. But what about, that should be our immediate response.
And that's been really shamed right now in
Oh
many
my,
areas,
oh my God.
that because people think, no, once that science is there, regardless of where it is and what field, you need to believe that like it's religion.
Right.
Believe it, don't question it. To question it's not allowed.
The cosmologists are telling us that the James Webb Telescope is telling us that several of our most fundamental beliefs that have endured for ages are questionable right now. This is the very nature of science, and this is the way it should be.
Good. I mean, it's good that people are getting that stuff out there. But
Yeah.
another thing, what are some of the other examples of issues it could be, if not narcissism? You mentioned one of them, but what are some others?
I talk about the aggressive personalities. These are the folks, narcissists are so self absorbed, generally speaking, regardless of the type, that they just don't pay much attention to your cares, your needs, because they're mostly interested in theirs. Okay. But the aggressive personalities go one step further. They've got all these narcissistic qualities, that's for sure. But they're hell bent on dominance. They always want to win, to be on top, in control. In my workshops, I say, like they say in real estate, where only three things matter: location, location, location. For these individuals, only three things matter: position, position, position. And if they're here and you're here, they're very happy. And if you're here and they're here, they're very unhappy, and they're going to do something to change that. They will accept this grudgingly.
Okay.
They will accept the level playing field very grudgingly.
And so you say that's different. That's a different thing than
It's a whole
narcissism.
different thing. It's beyond mere narcissism.
Okay.
Yes. Yeah.
And how about this? The ones, I know you have mentioned this in character disturbance, but the fact that a lot of bullies don't have low self-esteem, they actually have too much, they have found in some of these new studies.
Right. And I, very early on in my clinical research, I was looking at that because I was consulting in schools and in institutions where these folks were being treated in one way or another. And yeah, it was quite clear. There was an interesting event that happened to me one time, actually in an inpatient setting, in a kind of what we used to call reform school kind of environment. That's what we used to call it back in my former days. At any rate, there was a young man who needed to be in a program, sitting behind another young man who everybody on the unit thought was a friend, and he's flicking the guy's ear like this to annoy him, and the guy turns around and stop. He says stop, but he keeps doing it, and all kinds of interpretations were made about this young man and why he was doing that. Finally, the person had to get really upset and said, "You better just stop it, or I'm going to knock your block off." And finally, he stopped, but he was laughing the whole time. And all kinds of interpretations were made by the staff about why he was an angry young man, probably without even knowing it, abused, harboring anger about maybe some elements of his home situation, et cetera, and acting it out in that way. But in fact, in working with this young man, it became quite evident, and he was willing to just say openly that it was amusing to him because the way he looked at people, they're there for his entertainment anyway. Their wants, their needs, their concerns are not in his radar. They're not something he even thinks about,
Yeah.
you know. So even this friend of his was not the kind of friend that we would think of perhaps as a friend who we care about and who we would never hurt just for pure entertainment value on our part. We wouldn't dream of it. But he
Right.
didn't have a friend like that.
Right. And then
He
they
was
see
not capable of,
tools.
I'm sorry?
They see them as tools just
That's
for their own amusement.
right. Yeah, objectifying. Yes.
Right.
Yeah.
And what are your thoughts on shame and narcissists and character disordered people?
Well, shame has a bad name because for years, many well meaning folks were telling us that all shame is bad, that it's okay to feel badly about something you did, which is the essence of guilt, that may have injured somebody, but it was never a good idea to feel badly about yourself as a person. But I can tell you that certain brands of narcissism are defined by shamelessness.
Hmm.
You will even have people tell you, I know how this looks to some people. I know how I look to some people. I'm aware. I don't care.
And that's in contrast to what a lot of people would have you believe. They'll say, no, they're full of toxic shame.
Right,
Or I've heard Brene Brown say narcissism is a shame based fear of being ordinary.
right, right. And it can, if it's of the compensatory type, yes, that can happen. Once again, that broad brush, this we think we know kind of attitude because we've seen it once. If we don't, if we don't all, including us scientists, have some humility and admit that what we know is what we think we know right now with the information we have.
Right.
And just because we have one example, or maybe even two, or maybe even a dozen, doesn't mean we know it all. So that can happen. But some narcissism is defined by the relative incapacity for shame, and it's
Hmm.
not an act. I don't feel it.
Hmm.
I just don't feel it.
So
And I
similar to
know,
empathy,
right,
similar to empathy in that way.
right. And they'll tell you, I know that you want me to feel it. I know how you think this looks. And you think I ought to be just abhorred by the whole thing. But I'm not.
Uh,
I like me just like this. You hear
right.
me?
And it's a lot. It's a lot to ask, especially when them doing that gets them more of what they want. It gets them rewarded by society. So it's where's the negative repercussions for them?
Right. And here's the other thing, Jared. I really believe this strongly because experience has borne it out many, many times. If there is something underneath it, some early childhood trauma or dynamic, I promise you, it will flush out. That will flush out if you start dealing with the behavior here and now. In other words, if you frustrate in some way the person's usual way, if you tell them basically, you know what, it's not going to go the way you want it to go, you're not going to be able to get away with the same things that you always do. If you put a kibosh to that, whatever is underneath it that's driving it, if there is something underneath it that's driving it, it will flush out and then you can work with it. But you have to work with the destructive behavior itself. Otherwise, you're not going to get anywhere.
Right.
I mean, this is a very complicated topic that I spend all day long in work, used to spend all day long in workshops addressing through vignettes and other things. So it's not something we can cover really very well in 10 minutes. I'm
I
just
get
going to give you the nuts and bolts of it.
It's important. It's important stuff, though.
Yeah.
Another one people get wrong about denial. And I know you've gone over that a couple times in your books, but what do people get wrong about denial?
Well, the classic notion about the defense mechanism of denial is that the person has unconsciously blocked out of their mind something that's just too painful to acknowledge. And I give in several of my books, in Character Disturbance and In Sheep's Clothing, Essentials for the Journey, I give examples of the classical type of denial. I give an example, for example, of a married couple that's been married nearly 50 years. They've never been unfaithful. They are bound to each other, and the one partner looks like they've had a stroke, and they're hospitalized, and they eventually become comatose, and it looks like within a blink of an eye that they may be near death. And the other partner is not quite ready to accept that. They don't know that. They don't know fully, consciously perhaps. And so they keep saying that the person is going to recover. They stand by their side. They visit every day. They talk to the person, even though the person can't hear them. And even though the professionals say, basically the person's gone, but they're not prepared for that kind of pain just yet. So they're for a while in denial about it. Now, this is not something they choose. This is something that nature does for them automatically to protect them from pain. It's an unconscious process. Lying, refusing to admit what you know darn well is true for the sake of saving face, or because you want to keep doing what you've been doing that's been paying off in some way, despite the negative consequences, lying is not denial. Denial is an unconscious process. Lying is tactical.
Right.
And I know a lot of therapists who waste time and energy. I'm very big on wasting time and energy. You waste time and energy when you try to get people to see what they already see. They see but disagree. That's a waste of time and energy. It's also a waste of time waiting for people who you think are in denial to come out of this denial, when in fact they're just not shooting straight with you. And you really just need to set some limits with that. I mean, I basically right from the beginning say, well, if in fact you don't have a problem, then you're wasting your money being in here. So see ya. Come back when you have a problem.
And that's important. It gets to the root of it. It gets to the root of it. If they don't think there's a problem,
Right.
you can't really do much for somebody that doesn't think there's any kind of problem.
Well, it's not that they don't think so. They know they have a problem.
Well, they're not admitting it.
Right. And there's a reason for that. And a classic thought is, well, because it's too painful. No, the actual reason is because what they're doing right now is still working enough that the cost of change is too high. There would be too much work and too much pain involved. And they haven't developed the heart yet for that kind of work. And that's what I have to present as a therapist. That's what I have to present as the challenge. And that usually has to be done incrementally. For you, sir, or for you, ma'am, to acknowledge that this is a problem and to do all that it would take to modify your style. It's going to take some work, and it's going to take some dedication, and you're going to fail, and you're going to want to go back to your old ways, and you're not going to see the benefit, at least not right away. And you're going to wonder, why put out the effort? Why make the commitment? And I can work with that. But we have to start from a place of truth. Because if we don't start there, and if you don't know that I'm telling the truth, then you're not going to have the trust that's necessary to stick with me as we work through this hard work that you're going to have to do, this hard work of change. Change is hard. It's especially hard when you're already in midlife and you've been doing things a certain way more than half your life.
Right. And that's why people need to bottom out a lot of times. And that's where people that go to AA or NA, that's
Right.
usually what happens that precedes their entry into those programs. They've had some major catastrophe.
That's
And when
correct.
they're bottomed out, then they're finally willing to do something different.
That's correct. That's correct. That's when the cost of change pales into comparison to the cost of doing business as usual. You see, we are creatures of economy. This is basic learning theory. We want to have the most for the least amount of effort. We don't like to work unless we sense a payoff.
Right.
You know, I don't know anybody that wants to go and pick up garbage all day long if they don't think they're going to get paid to do it or
Right.
get some kind of reward, even if you're one of those people whose social service enterprises put volunteers on the side of the road to give you the wholesome feeling of having done something to clean up the mess out there. You know, there's got to be some satisfaction derived from doing the work. Otherwise, we don't like to do it.
Right.
We want to get something out of it, even if it's just a good feeling of having done something meritorious.
Perhaps avoiding negative consequences. Would that be enough?
Well, so that
To
once
start.
again, when people are hitting bottom, that's usually the case. You know, they're avoiding the negative consequences of doing business as usual. And that's when they become more willing to start doing the work of building character.
Right. And this might surprise some people, but have you had success treating narcissists and people who are character disordered? And if so, what did that look like?
Well, it looks very different depending on type and degree. I'll go back to that broken record. And narcissists, what type? How serious? How virulent? How malignant? With what level of empathy capacity? With what level of self-absorption? Very, very different outcomes.
Right.
So, yes, I have had some success. And I'll go back to shame too. Of all the people that I've worked with character impairments of one level or another, of all the people who actually did make that major life turnaround, I can tell you that to a person, the key factor was not guilt. I know some people who felt very badly every time they did something really horribly stupid, but still did it again.
Hmm, that's
You
true.
know, what really made the difference is when they took a look in the mirror and no longer were content with the person that they had allowed themselves to become. Shame was the biggest motivator for folks who did make the turnaround.
I think that's very important to emphasize because, like you said, most people are going to tell you in the self help or psychological world, shame's not good.
Right,
Stop feeling shame.
right.
Drop that toxic shame.
Well, shame can be toxic
Right.
and it can be pointless. You're right. You can be made to feel horrible about yourself for a lot of ungodly reasons. I'm not saying that there isn't such thing as toxic shame. I'm just saying not all shame is toxic.
Important distinction. I mean, it's where the nuance comes into play. And I think right on the heels of we're in a character deficiency, we're also definitely in a nuance deficiency where we see things in black and white.
Because it's easier. Like I'll go back to it. That's a general rule. We are creatures of economy. We want that sense of security, and we'll take it the easiest way we can get it. It's much more. You have to have a heart for this work. You have to really want to love people, even the ugly ones. And I'm not talking about physical
Yeah.
attributes here. I'm talking about ugliness of character. You have to really want to love people. And as any loving parent knows, um, who's had more than one child, sometimes you're presented with a cluster of tendencies in that other life that you're trying to raise that aren't that easy to deal with. And so you have to learn all the fine nuances, all the different little things that make the person tick, and work with that. You have to set some appropriate limits and boundaries. Some things just can't be, some behaviors just can't stand, you know? And so you have to do that. But that doesn't mean you reject the person or that you don't do your best to work with them. And that also doesn't mean that you reason with them by telling them how misguided they are. Most kids don't like to be preached to, neither do adults. You only get backlash. What they want to see is they want to have the experience of what can be different in life by modifying their approach to life and by modifying their approach to relationships. And so I've worked with many people on the character disturbance spectrum. Have I had stellar results with folks on the far side of the spectrum? Absolutely not. Do people working with folks on the autistic spectrum have stellar results with the folks who are severely autistic and are stuck in their own world and can't even relate? Heck no. But some, in that vast continuum, there are varying degrees of success. I have two nephews that are on the spectrum. You would never know it. They were mildly on the spectrum, mildly to moderately, and they got all of the right kind of interventions, and fortunately also early enough that you would be hard pressed to know it. Whole different prognosis. So you got to match the intervention with the condition, and conditions exist along spectra, along continua. I know I'm beating that dead horse pretty good, but I'm going to keep saying it and
It's
keep
necessary. It's necessary. And I think what also you're saying is you got to sell them the benefits. You got to convince them, well, what's in it for you,
well,
for you to change.
you got to lead them to the water. You can't make them drink. When they drink, when they decide to drink, they'll find the benefits themselves. Oh my gosh, I'm not thirsty anymore.
Okay.
You don't have to sell them on the benefits. They experience the benefits. You do have to do some gentle leading, though, and reinforcing.
Okay.
In behavioral terms, we call that successive approximations to the goal. And every step, no matter how small or seemingly insignificant, needs to be reinforced. Yeah.
Okay. So, what would Dr. George Simon's recommendations be for other therapists or licensed clinical social workers, psychologists for treating narcissists and other character disordered people?
I would say heed this axiom. This may sound a little rough, but in med school, they teach students early on that intervention in the absence of and not in accordance with very sound diagnosis is the actual definition of malpractice. It's the best single definition of malpractice. So, in other words, whatever you're doing, make sure to the best of your ability that without bias and without preconceptualization, without preconception, that you know who you're dealing with in all the fine nuances. Who is this person? Where are they on the various spectra? What's contributing to this? And have your mind open. Don't act like you already know, because everybody's different, before you intervene. And then intervene accordingly with the sound diagnosis. And especially, I advise probably you don't want to waste your time and energy getting people to see. Rather than focus on the mentality, focus on the behavior. The mentality will change later, and any resistance to change will tell you what you have to work on, what you have to focus on more.
That makes sense. And I've heard you say this before too, that we have to act our way into a better way of thinking,
Thank you. That's
as
exactly.
opposed to vice versa.
All the great spiritual masters throughout the ages have said the same thing, basically. You know, I follow the Christian tradition. We have one axiom, one. It's the hardest thing in the world to do, but it's a simple, straightforward axiom: love. Now, discerning what that is and doing it even when you don't feel like it is tough, but it changes you. If you'll do it, if you will do it, your mentality changes,
Mm.
outlook changes, you change, and it's infectious. You find other people changing too.
And it sounds like you have to divorce yourself a little bit from the feelings, because sometimes the feelings may prevent you from doing what an act of love is in some cases.
Absolutely. Absolutely. What one of my mentors said, you do the thing that you do the very thing you fear to do, or the thing that seems counterintuitive, you
Right.
do it anyway. You have the courage to just do it.
Right. That's my favorite definition of courage, is doing the right thing regardless of how you feel. And
Exactly.
that involves people having to separate themselves from that feeling and take that step back
Right.
and respond rather than react. And
Absolutely.
that seems like a superpower for a lot of people these days too.
Yeah. Yeah. Always enjoy these conversations, Jared.
Me too. Definitely me too. And I was going to ask you as well. You've mentioned a lot of times the trauma induced therapy, right?
Yeah.
Or maybe I said that wrong. Therapy induced trauma,
Yeah.
excuse me.
Yeah.
But what are your recommendations to get people to avoid that phenomenon from occurring?
Yeah. Yeah. And this happens in a number of different ways. Some of my colleagues call this iatrogenic trauma, where the intervention itself re-traumatizes you. And this happens most frequently. It can happen in other ways too, but most frequently it happens when somebody has cajoled their character impaired partner to come into a joint therapy session with them. But the character impaired partner is really good at the art of positive impression management. They're capable of looking good without being good. They're capable of subtle manipulations and whatnot, and so they somehow, in the other relationship partner's mind, manage to uh, sway the therapist into thinking that maybe they're not who the other person has come to realize that they are. And all of a sudden, the therapist thinks, oh my God, I came in here feeling bad enough about myself. Now I feel even worse. And every time I try to make a case for, he or she is doing it again, don't you see? I get shot down. And so that ends. I mean, there are other scenarios where that can happen, therapy induced trauma, but that's probably the most common way that it
Okay,
happens. Yeah.
that's a good one.
Yeah.
And another thing, and this is something that I got from your newest book, no one's entitled to respect. People can have compassionate treatment. That's one thing. But respect is another thing. And I know you're big on self respect. So,
Yeah. Well, I'm big on I'm big on words having to mean things and being kind of a stickler for accuracy. In other areas of science, especially medical science, if a lab report says that this is a squamous cell carcinoma, we know exactly what that means. But I think that therapists, by and large, have been guilty over the past several decades of misusing terms and misunderstanding terms egregiously, acting out being the primary one, which has become synonymous with misbehavior. Freud would be rolling over in his grave. Acting up is not acting out. It can be a sign of acting out, but rarely is it. And we overuse that term and incorrectly so. Codependency is another one. Oh,
Well,
don't get me started on that one.
so what's the right way to use acting out?
Acting out, I give two examples in all my books about classical acting out. It's a doing through actions, acting through actions, an unconscious conflict. And I give an example of that, uh, a non-biologically based repetition compulsion or compulsion, like a guy goes into his boss to turn in an assignment that he was given, and the boss curtly says, well, it's about time you blah, blah, blah. And the employee feels bad and mutters under his breath, that son of a bee, and but feels horrible about it inside, is having real qualms, is feeling qualms, is feeling sick to his stomach because on the one hand he hates to be the person with all that anger and rage, but he doesn't know this, and so he goes into the washroom, the employee washroom, and he starts washing his hands until they bleed to get the
Mm.
stain of his unforgivable sin off him just because he muttered under his breath that SOB. Now this kind of neurosis doesn't even happen these days very often, but that's an example of acting out where the action really represents something that's going on underneath, this internal conflict, emotional conflict that the person's not really aware of, and they're easing the anxiety associated with it with an action. Just misbehavior, just not acting right is not necessarily acting out.
Okay.
But that term is overused. Um, and so when it comes to self esteem and self respect, those words have meanings. Um, Respect actually comes from the Latin respectere. We get the term spectacles from the Latin, and that's part of the root respectere. Spectere has to do with looking. And respectere means to look again or to look back. And so self respect has to do with looking back, a retrospective assessment of your behavior, your manner of operating in the world, maybe even your achievements, several other things. And if you can look back on what you've done with all you've been given, with some degree of rightful self satisfaction, that's respect. That's self respect. We earn respect by what we do, how we treat people, et cetera, et cetera. Now, self esteem is the intuitive estimate that we make about our worth. And sadly, in our day and time, there are a lot of folks who don't understand human worth or where it comes from. And many equate their worth with their nature endowed talents and abilities, not what they've done with them. I make that point in the book. You're actually not responsible for the gifts that nature endows you with, but you are 100% responsible for how you use them and what you do with those things. So I know a lot of people who have an inflated sense of self worth, but no cause for self respect, and vice versa.
Right, right.
Yeah,
And I think, especially with the innate traits we've been given, gratitude is something that we should all have for those things. And I think gratitude is another thing that we're in a shortage of right now with a lot of people. They don't appear with their behaviors to be very grateful.
yeah. Well, and you mentioned the 12-step programs earlier. That has a lot to do with one's relationship to any kind of a higher power. Whether you want to see those gifts as accidents of nature or gifts of God, it really has to do with how you see yourself in relationship to that ultimate something bigger. You know, the universe grants us these things, and if we have a right relationship with the universe, we should be in some awe. We should be in some awe about what we've been given. And if you have some sense of obligation to honor the gifts and to do something good with them, I would say that's the essence of good character. But it all starts with that relationship you have to that higher something.
Right. And a lot of people just have no relationship, period, with anything higher than them. And that's
Exactly.
one of the trademarks you have said of
Nar-
character disorder, period. They don't, there's nothing bigger than themselves.
exactly. Yeah. Yeah.
And
And
that,
that was really the that was the subtle underlying message in the tale of Narcissus. Because he's already found all that he needs in this perfect reflection of himself. All the other advances, all the other relationship seekers, the nymphs who say, I want this relationship with you. I really think you're something. He's got no time for it because he's got it all.
right.
Got no need for anything else. That's the message in the story. And that's the sad dilemma of this narcissistic age. It's one thing to need people. It's quite another thing to use people exploitatively as objects. And it's a real testament to character to be able to lovingly and to be willing and to desire to lovingly relate to people as people of value, with whom you have nothing but positive regard. That's what Carl Rogers called it,
Hmm.
positive regard.
Unconditional positive regard is what he would say.
Yeah. Well, if love isn't unconditional, it's not love.
You think so?
Right. If it's not unconditional, it's not love. It could be one of its close cousins. I can have a lot of even warm, tender feelings toward you and lots of appreciation of you. But if my expectation is that if I do this and that and the other thing, I get something back, then that's not pure love.
So you're saying that an unconditional love would love regardless.
Would love regardless. Even if the situation is this is why so many relationships that for one reason or another have to end in divorce are so bitter afterward. If a situation is unworkable, or if we are truly not meant to be in a kind of a relationship that will help us both grow, love has no hard feelings attached to it. If I ever really loved you, all I want is well for you, even if I no longer get anything from you.
So I guess my pushback on that would be, I mean, what are you supposed to do if someone disrespects you? Like, what's the
Well, you're supposed to
unconditional
love
love way?
yourself first. and,
All
and
right.
you're
Okay.
not supposed to tolerate that.
Okay.
And you might
That's
not even be there, but that doesn't mean you wish anything but well to the other person,
okay.
which might include, by the way, boy, I sure hope they change that behavior.
Okay. So now that you mentioned it that way, I agree with that. And I'd say, okay, yeah, we have to love ourselves first, and that means we have to make choices or assert boundaries, enforce boundaries,
Absolutely.
etc.
You know, a real key to, you mentioned boundary, a real key to discriminating real love from its close cousins and some of its imposters is knowing what boundaries are meant to be eliminated. In other words, what barriers to intimacy, what barriers to communication, to heart relationship, what barriers have to come down versus what boundaries have to be firmly enforced and held and imposed. Discriminating that is the real secret. It's the real art to knowing how to love,
I agree with. I mean, it's
starting with
about
yourself.
the wisdom to understand which one's which.
Exactly.
And
Yeah.
I think, I mean, from someone in your generation, you must look at the younger generations and think, wow, it seems to be like a chaos out there. The dating world right now for a lot of younger people is absolute chaos.
Right. And for example, I'll go back to a therapy thing and therapy induced trauma. When you're asking somebody about, say, an abusive behavior, and they start basically giving their rationalization, their excuse, or they blame the other person for their response, and you let that go, you don't impose a boundary, set a limit, which is what lovers do. When what lovers do is they break down all the barriers to intimacy and understanding, and they impose limits and boundaries with irresponsible behavior.
Hmm.
So when that excuse starts, when that blaming starts, if that boundary isn't firmly imposed and you say, you know what, let me hear you try this without any blaming of the victim. See if you can rephrase it any other way. And make that invitation. Now, I didn't give a definite way to do it. I'm trying to make an example here of what it's like to impose a boundary that is the essence of love in the moment. That's not the kind of thing we do here. This is a training ground. This is a training ground for love.
I think it's a
And
good thing to strive for and a good thing for us to be trying to do.
right. And so in here, when we're talking about something we did that we need to correct, we don't make excuses and we don't blame others. That's just not what we do because nothing gets better that way.
Correct.
And
No
I
blame shifting.
and I'm an advocate for making things better.
Right. And it's about how we say things, right? It's not even about as much sometimes what we say, how we say it can go just as far.
Exactly right. You know, some folks in their training, in their professional training, whether they be social workers or professional counselors or nurse practitioners or psychologists, some people in their training have the advantage of watching a session through a one-way glass that looks like a mirror in the other room. And when you're just the observer, when you're not actually in the process, you observe all the fine nuances of interactions and you instantly become a genius. You instantly pick up on things that people actually in the process can't easily tune into because they're too immersed in the process itself. So, really seasoned helpers learn how to do both. They learn how to be the person invested in the process, but at the same time, be the person behind the glass watching it all happen. It's a real art. It's a tricky little art.
Lots of self-awareness and emotional self-control is
Yeah,
what that takes.
right. And a second ear and a second pair of eyes, so that you're also thinking to yourself, what's really going on here? You know, why am I feeling some disquiet about this? What is it about the manner? It's not so much what he or she is saying, but in the way she or he is saying it. What's going on non-verbally here? What is this facial expression all about? What was that eye rolling all about? Uh, all of that. You have to be observing that and processing it and contemplating what the loving response to that is, what the
It's a lot.
constructive response is to that. Right.
It's a lot. I mean, it's a lot for people to learn all of this. It takes maturity, it takes wisdom, it takes honest self-reflection, humility.
I can promise you this: I didn't have that kind of awareness in my early years of therapy, and I'm still learning every day.
And that's the attitude of humility right there. Just to always be learning that we're never arrived, we're never complete, like the process never ends in that way.
Right.
There's always more to learn, and we don't know what we don't know.
Yeah.
We can't see our own blind spots by definition, things like that.
In my workshops, I always present vignettes where I did it a lot wrong, and show the effect of that.
Yeah. I mean, it's good. It's good for you to demonstrate that so they can see, okay, he's willing to open up about this. So maybe I'll be willing to look at what I'm doing here as well. And now that you're talking about relationships, it reminded me what you said earlier about how people use the word codependency wrong.
Oh
How
my
do
God.
people use that word wrong? I know we've gone over this last time too, but
Okay. It's become synonymous it's become synonymous with a lot of things. It's become synonymous with emotional dependency, which is a very different animal from true codependency. The term was coined, it came out of early addiction relationship partner research. And for the truly chemically dependent person, for the person who experiences heightened levels of tolerance and would experience withdrawal. And that's why they stay completely dependent on the substance to function, because their system's gotten so used to it that they experience pain, true pain, without it. So they're dependent on it to function. In those environments where the truly addicted person's life is completely governed by the substance. In the family system of those folks, other folks' life is similarly controlled by the substance in a way, because everything they do is dictated by this person's addiction. That the addicted person doesn't pay the bills, doesn't earn enough money to support the family, doesn't do this, doesn't do that, and everybody else is picking up the slack. So their lives are just as much dictated to by the substance as the addicted person. They would have entirely different lives if it weren't for this impact of this substance on the addict's life. So in a sense, they are codependent. We have co-pilots that operate airplanes, right? There's a definition there. The word is, once again, I'm a stickler for the terms. The prefix co has a meaning. It means they both have piloting responsibilities. Okay? So there's a co. It's not interdependence. It's not mutual dependence. It's not emotional dependence. Codependency, in a sense, does exist, but most of the time when the term is used, what the clinician probably really means is that somebody in an abusive relationship is struggling with too much emotional dependency to leave it.
Mm.
And getting, once again, without the right diagnosis, the intervention is going to be malpractice. Sorry. If you don't see it right, you're not going to do it right.
And that's a huge one right there. Cause I get the sense there's all sorts of misdiagnoses out there that I mean, I've heard statistics that, for example, narcissism can be misdiagnosed as bipolar up to 50% of the time. Or
Yeah. You know, when someone's in a hypomanic or a manic episode, they have inflated ego. I mean, they have all these features that are common to narcissism, and on steroids. So yes, people in that phase of the illness can look like narcissists. And and especially if their illness is primarily biologically based, when they're properly treated medically, they don't look narcissistic. Now, can you be a narcissist and also be bipolar? Oh, well, yes, you can.
sure.
So sometimes when somebody's no longer in a manic or a hypomanic episode, they still got a bit of an ego inflation going on. You know,
Yeah.
things are, we're always coming out with something new. And then, like I said earlier, painting with too broad a brush, overgeneralizing, because we want to tout our findings and whatnot. A little humility would do us all very good when it comes to what we think we know.
I would agree with that. And I think people just struggle with more than one thing being true at the same time.
Yeah.
They want it to be
Those simple answers that give us a sense of security.
right.
Yeah.
And I see it with that. I see it with narcissism and bipolar. I see it with ADHD and narcissism now too. That's another big one where people I'm no clinician, but I see some people that claim to be ADHD acting pretty character disordered for sure. Now, is it narcissism? Hard to say, but they do seem fairly character disordered as well.
Well, we do have an industry out there, and most folks that I know are on multiple medications of one type or another, whether it be for just purely physical illnesses or emotional and mental illnesses or a combination of both. We are a very heavily medicated society. And there are some conditions that develop because nature is trying to tell us something. For example, I mentioned in all my books the types of depressions that are purely reactive, that are not strictly biologically based, that are nature's way of telling us, you're fighting a losing battle here. You're getting down and you're being sapped of energy because you keep investing yourself in something you don't have any power over. And you're feeling miserable as a result, but you keep trying anyway to make something happen that you don't have the power to make happen. And it's killing you emotionally. And nature is telling you, stop. So here's what happens if you get on medicine. You feel better enough to keep on doing the crazy crap you've been doing. And then the next emotional crash has to be worse than the last one.
Now, would you say sometimes
Sometimes.
that happens, right?
Sometimes.
I don't know about all the time.
Oh, no.
Sometimes. For
Once
sure.
again, we're not going to paint with that broad brush. With those strictly reactive type depressions that don't have a solidly biological basis, I think in those cases, in that instance, it's actually less helpful to have medicine help you keep doing the self-destructive thing that you're doing when nature is trying to tell you to stop, and you forestall that bottom that would help you turn things around.
That's an interesting way to see it.
Yeah.
And would you say like SSRIs and things like that are overprescribed?
Well, they are. But that doesn't mean that they're not absolutely necessary sometimes. They are.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, and my philosophy would be a prescription drug should be the last line of defense. For the very most part, there's other things to try before that, I would say, like sleep, diet, exercise,
Well,
community.
in the case of chemistry gone awry, say for example, what happens hormonally in some postpartum depressions. In those cases, I'm not sure that the first intervention shouldn't be medical. I
Fair
mean,
enough.
I just absolutely refuse to paint with that rub.
That's you make a good point. So sometimes you say it could be, and other times
Yeah,
probably not.
right. Sound diagnosis is hard.
Yeah, I mean,
It's really hard.
yeah, I mean, it's why they call it a practice, right?
Right. But you know what? I challenged my workshop attendees all the time. I challenged them about how many times many of us have, and I did this in the past too. I was guilty of it many times. Just start talking to people and intervening without knowing enough about what we were dealing with to know how to intervene. So we've already begun the process and we're not sure of where we're going and we're too okay with that sometimes.
Yeah, I understand. So our friend Eccentric says this is real wisdom beyond the mental health field. Thought you'd want to see that. So he appreciates it, or she. I shouldn't assume.
Yeah. Well, it's edifying to get the comments that I get these days. It's very edifying. There was a time early in my career where I have to say I was so flattered to actually be invited to do some medical grand rounds. And back in the day, 30, 40 years ago, um, especially in medicine, Freudian psychology was still king. Um, Even though most psychiatrists were being trained to be pill pushers. Uh, but if they were doing any kind of intervention, it was still along Freudian lines. So in those early days when I was doing grand rounds, uh, interns and residents and whatnot would walk out in disgust.
Really?
I was so flattered to be invited and so dejected when I never did get booed, but I mean, to see everybody just shake their head and leave was not.
When you were speaking,
Oh yeah.
what
Oh,
would they walk out about? For what? When you said what?
say things like not all narcissists are compensating for underlying feelings of insecurity. That can happen, but that doesn't have to be the case. And all like that. Oh yeah. And there was even a thinking at the time as medicine was becoming the treatment of choice for all psychiatry, there was even a thought at the time that the whole construct of personality and character, we had to do away with that. That everything was biology and everything was chemical balances. And if we had the right chemical balances in us for everything, we'd all be just fine. Yeah.
So,
So
and that's symptomatic of what we see everywhere now. So even the mental health professionals, they're walking out on you because you said narcissism isn't always covering up for insecurity, and they walk out.
yeah,
And that's
that was then.
no, but that
It's
same
not the
behavior,
same now.
but that same behavior though is evident everywhere online. If I post something people don't agree with, an example, I called Elon Musk narcissistic, and I lost a lot of people
Oh,
from
right.
from saying that
Yeah.
because I dared to say something about somebody they
Right.
didn't like or they liked.
Right.
So, but that same behavior I see now,
Right.
and it's tough. It's tough to deal with that.
Right. Right. The essence of narcissism is hard to pin down sometimes, but one thing you can be sure of is that it exists whether a person is accomplished or not, whether they have a great deal of knowledge or not, and whether they have a great deal of accomplishment or not. The thing with narcissism has to do with the overestimate. So it's not that some narcissistic people aren't accomplished. Some are very accomplished, just not as accomplished as they think, and capable, just not as capable as they think,
Right.
or smart. They're smart many times, but maybe not as smart as they think.
Sure, sure. They love to over exaggerate and emphasize those qualities.
Yeah,
And that's the false self, right? The inflated false selves of them that they want that
right.
reflection, that image
Yeah,
to be
yeah.
affirmed.
Once again, I have a problem with the accuracy of. I've used the term myself too, the false self.
You don't like it.
I don't like it because it's very real. It's
Okay.
very real. I know what we're getting at when we use the term because it's not, at the same time, it's real, it's not real. In other words, it's not accurate. It's not well founded, not well grounded.
And that is a little different. I mean, I think because they believe it,
Right,
right? They don't necessarily think it's a false self, right?
right, right,
So, and if they believe it,
right,
it's becoming kind of what
right.
they're acting as if is true.
Exactly.
To go
Yeah,
back to what we were saying before.
yeah. One of my favorite mentors is famous for saying, "In their mind, thinking makes it so." If,
Yeah.
if they say it's so, in their mind, it's so.
Right.
there's no objective test. There's no objective check on reality.
Yeah. And
Their
they want to
reality
surround
is
themselves with
reality.
people that are going to reflect that back to them.
They want the amen corner there. That's
Sure.
exactly right.
And Sandra here says, what Dr. Simon helped me recognize is how narcissists have no regard for things you regard unless it adversely affects them. It took me a long time to catch that.
I appreciate that. Like I said, it's very edifying to find that my work has had resonance. I think that's why. I mean, we still get from various countries. I think there's only a few countries now on the African continent where we've yet to publish, but this phenomenon of character disturbance and character awareness has happened everywhere. So I think in sheep's clothing is now, just counting on here, maybe 30 some languages and countries right now, and more to come. But I think the reason for that is that there's resonance. And one of the things I'm rewriting for its 30-year anniversary edition, a new edition of In Sheep's Clothing. And when I first described the phenomenon that we now call gaslighting, clinicians weren't commonly agreeing on the term for this crazy making feeling that where you know in your gut that something's not right, but your manipulator has you thinking that you're all messed up in the head, that they're not doing what you're thinking they're doing, that you gut tells you they're doing, but they have you doubting yourself. I described this phenomenon without a label because we weren't using that label, gaslighting, which last year was the most commonly Googled term,
Yeah.
top of the list. But we weren't using that term. But in just describing that phenomenon, that's what caused In Sheep's Clothing to take off. And I had no idea that that was going to happen. That was not my intention. I had just kind of come across the phenomenon and I thought to describe it. And I mean, letters, emails, all kinds of stuff just started happening just like that. And that was very edifying. And that maybe emboldened is not it encouraged me it encouraged me to persist in the work because through just happenstance and stumbling on something and having the capacity to appreciate what was laid before me and in describing it, there was resonance for a lot of people. They thought, oh my God, that happens with me.
Right.
You described my relationship.
So many people just relate to the whole thing, the crazy making effect, gaslighting, and it's why there's so many people talking about narcissism. And I'm sure you don't like some of it because they have the black and white thinking with it and the
Yeah,
generalizations, but there is a reason why so many people are.
right. Yeah. And it's a sign of the times.
Right. And Sandra also says, or I should ask you even, the Judas syndrome. What is that?
Okay, the Judas Syndrome is now officially out of print. There are still some copies available. It was the only book that was actually solicited by a publishing house in Nashville. Uh, and they asked me to write a book for the Christian faith community about my insights and my own spiritual growth, development, and to write about basically the power of genuine faith. That's another term that we misuse. Um, if you truly have faith in your broker, I mean real faith. I mean you absolutely trust this person, and they tell you that what you need to do is to put your assets in this place, and you have absolutely no doubts that this person is completely trustworthy, that they know what they're talking about, and that I can leap off that step of the stairs and they will catch me. I can take that leap, trust them. Then I'm going to move my assets to exactly where they say. And that's why there is absolutely no distinction between real faith and right action. None.
Interesting. I have not read that book of yours, so maybe I got to try to find it.
And the Judas syndrome has to do with how people betray their lack of faith in their unloving actions. Their unloving actions tell you where their faith really is, whether they still trust in power, prestige, money, all those kinds of things that the world tells us to place our faith in. And so, I take this command that we have seriously, and I haven't always done it. And even in my taking it seriously, do I take it seriously enough to fully transform my life? Heck no. I'm the worst offender when it comes to loving unconditionally. For the Christian audience, we're not that mandatum, as we call it, the last command to the followers was not just to love. There's a caveat there. The unfortunate translations say that it was a new commandment. It's not new. Not new. It's a reframe, and that's the actual meaning of the Greek. But that's a whole other discussion. But he actually gives you the how. He says, "Love one another as I have loved you, the same way I've done it, same way I've showed it, to the mat, willing to die, unconditional."
Hmm.
Do that. It was not a suggestion. And for people who say that they believe that this is the human face of the divine giving an authoritative command, but then don't heed the command, what they say about faith is pure bunk.
Hmm.
Because if you believe that's the truth, that this is the absolute authority telling you exactly what to do and you don't do it, then I'm sorry, you don't believe. Period.
Hmm.
That's the Judas syndrome in a nutshell.
Interesting. And I think there's a lot of that right now. There's a lot of people. It just seems like there's a lot of people who aren't authentic and genuine in
Yeah,
their faith. It just seems like there's something hollow about it, or
right.
there's other things they're shooting for. At
Uh,
least that's the sense I get. I could be
right,
wrong.
right, right. And I have to tell you, a lot of folks who profess to be people of faith, I see them putting their faith in all kinds of things, all kinds of idols. Um, I used to be one of those, placed all my faith in the Constitution.
Ah, what a document.
Right. No, there's a law that supersedes that. And you know what? We got judges that interpret the Constitution in all kinds of ways. And you know
Yeah.
why they can interpret it in all kinds of ways? Because all of those interpretations serve a particular interest.
Yep. I mean, that's why they're there.
And that's why they're there.
Every Supreme Court justice is where they are because they believe certain things on certain topics,
Right.
or they wouldn't be. And that's just the
Yeah.
nature of the beast
Right.
right now. And it's not good. I mean, there's all sorts of room for corruption. There's room. And then AA and NA, they would say the same thing. They would say anything you put before your recovery is something you're going to lose.
That's right.
And it's something similar with faith, where it's like,
Right.
oh, anything you put above your higher power, well, you're going to probably lose that. There's going to be something that goes off the rails.
That's right. Yeah.
So it'd be nice for people to genuinely believe that more on a
Yeah.
grander scale. And what I've seen happen, not to get too political, but I feel like there's people on the left that have stopped liking religion. And so ironically, the people who have listened, I think. There's a lot of people who have listened to that. And so now, for people on the right, that was one of the things keeping them in line. They were really genuinely religious, a lot of them. But now that's gone for the very most part. Now it's gone on all sides. So now you see people replacing it with other things.
And
With
that's really why I felt compelled to put out Essentials for the Journey. It's more than just embracing what I call the 10 commandments of character. It's more than that. It's about the conversion of hearts. You know, we have some extremely unfortunate translations of some of the most important things that Christian followers believe that, or supposedly believe that the person we call Jesus, which is a horrible corruption of his name. It's amazing the person that we say we regard so highly, we don't even address by proper name. But this radical rabbi, Yeshua, uh, had some very important things to say, and sadly, some of the translations are just awful. But what we translate as repent, or the kingdom is at hand. I mean, I've studied the Greek very much. I used to formally study it, by the way, before I became a psychologist. But that's another story. But the Greek word metanoia, which is what we translate, unfortunately, has to do with a change of awareness, a change of heart and mind. So the actual call is to put on to have a new outlook, basically, to rethink things. Because what's before us is God's domain. This whole universe, this whole fantastic, magical, mystical reality that is freely given is right in front of us. And when we see it, and we see the intricacy of it all and the interconnectedness of it all and the grandeur of it all, and the absolute miracle that it is to be alive and to be having this human experience, it has to change our outlook. We're no longer so self-absorbed with the petty things that the world tells us we need to be paying attention to and to idolize. So everything that he says and he does takes on an entirely different meaning. And it brings us to a whole different kind of faith. And in some religious rites that go way, way back to the 2nd and 3rd century, more attention is given to those admonitions and instructions and a call to awakening, as we call it these days. Of course, there's the mob that's against anything that sounds woke, but the kind of awakening I'm talking about is awakening to the larger reality of things, to the bigger picture, to seeing this incomprehensible marvel that's right before us, and all that's possible if we would but discern the beauty and the intricacies of love and do our very best to radically love ourselves and everything and everyone else. It changes you. It gives you a new mind. And that's the call. The call is to a different kind of outlook about life, its purpose. My favorite quote ever is from Teilhard de Chardin. Do you know who he is?
I've heard the name.
Yeah. My favorite line from his is that we are not human beings, we are not human creatures having a spiritual experience or a spiritual experience, but spiritual creatures having a human experience. And those of us that have undergone some kind of rebirth or true baptism have encountered that spiritual soul that we have and know that it's real. To know that we are not, that we are more. We're not false. This is not a false self. It's part of us because we are immersed in this experience. So it's very real. But we are more. We are more fundamentally at the core. And until we are converted ourselves, and until we find ourselves, he says we have to lose ourselves first to find ourselves. He knows what he's talking about. And this is what I'm talking about, faith really changing everything. Real faith changes everything.
I've seen it. I mean, I've seen it firsthand in even places like AA and NA, like I said. Like, I do see it there. I see the power of that kind of thing. And that's just one version of it, but there's Christian versions, Muslim versions, Jewish versions, etc. So
I would challenge all those that think that that faith is in the magic words. The magic words where you tell everybody that you believe, and therefore you are now saved. Actually, the word translates rescued, not saved. We get the saved from the Latin version of that, salve, which also means to rescue, by the way.
and what's the significance of that distinction?
Well, the significance is that we are rescued from the operating principle of this world when, through faith in the person that tells us what to do and how to do it, we are transformed. We no longer idolize the things that we did idolize. And we come to know, we find that buried treasure, that immortal diamond, as one writer calls it, that precious gift of our very soul that was there in the beginning and will be there when this turns to dust. And we are rescued from the slavery of operating in this world on its terms instead of the enlightened terms that knowing how immortal we are and how free we are, how absolutely free we are to love, should we choose it. That's what makes us different. We have a choice about it. And that's what makes real love possible, because if it's conditional, it's not love. And we get to say yes by free choice. And that's what
Hmm.
makes the return love really love. If we think we're getting something for it.
It's something else, is what you're saying.
Exactly. Yeah.
And I think having kids helps people with this too. Once you have someone else that you're supposed to be looking out for, I think it helps people shed some of that selfishness
Right.
or just like only having to look out for themselves. And there's more people than ever choosing not to have kids now for various reasons.
Right.
And some of the reasons
Most of
aren't,
it is they're a burden.
well, yeah, that's one of the reasons.
this,
Sometimes,
this entitled crowd does not want any burdens.
no, they don't. They don't. People, I
No.
mean, some of them can be financial burdens too, but
Yeah.
it's tough. I see more people than ever just choosing to live for themselves.
Yeah. Well, society tells them that not only is that possible, but it's desirable.
And that circles back around to what we were saying in the beginning is you got to get people to, how do you reward the good character when having the low character is so rewarded?
Where my hope comes in, Jared, is that I know how hungry people are underneath it all. I've lived long enough and I've seen enough to see, to witness, to bear witness to the spiritual hunger that's there. It may be denied, it may be covered over with all these titillations and delights. We have a lot to amuse us and to occupy us and to satisfy us, at least to the short term. But I see a hunger out there that's pretty ravenous for something more meaningful.
Absolutely. I mean, I think, like I said, we're seeing people fill it with all the wrong kinds of things right now. We see people filling it with politics or social media or environmental concerns or fill in the blank. When not to say none of those concerns are important,
Right,
but it's like they're using what should be put towards something more spiritual and faith driven towards those things instead.
right. But they don't have the capacity to truly satisfy. The soul yearns for much more than that. We are made for love. It's that simple. Yeah,
And then the thing would be removing all of those obstacles, like you said, within ourselves, removing the things that allow us to do that. And that's a process in and of itself, too.
yeah. So I'm rewriting Judas syndrome, and I'm also preparing two small little, I don't know what to even call them. They're not leaflets, they're just tiny little books, probably be no more than 100 pages, little pocket things to carry around. And I'm also going to start a group, one of those groups on Facebook that'll also be on the other social media, just basically to really ponder these things that we've always that many folks within the different faith traditions have been familiar with, but haven't really seriously pondered. To fill the spiritual void, to help make a little bit different sense of what we've long heard about and verbalized with our lips that haven't really taken to heart. In the hopes of facilitating this awareness evolution that I think needs to take place for us to make it to the next level. And I've said this at workshops too, and I believe it sincerely. It starts with us getting honest, sometimes brutally honest, with ourselves about ourselves and with each other about each other. Having an honest, loving, no holds barred, but truly loving, genuinely constructive engagement to discern the truth about what we're really all about and what we are really wanting so that we can continue to evolve and make it to the next level without destroying ourselves and without needlessly dividing and hurting each other. We have gotten so in one of the worst parts of our narcissistic age is to take some delight in the division and the smacking and demeaning kinds of stuff. I mean, I don't really even like to single out individuals, but when a person openly mocks somebody who can't help their neurologically based physical deformity and disability, when somebody openly mocks that, and we're not only okay with it, but because of what we think that person's going to do for us, we think they should be in a leadership and power position, somebody that character, then that doesn't say so much about them. That says a whole lot about us.
Well, it's like V for Vendetta said, if you're looking for the guilty, you need only look into the mirror.
Yeah.
And that's true for a lot of this. And we talked about that last time too, where we can't expect our political leaders to rise too far above the level of thought of the average person. And I think we're seeing that.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, but one step at a time,
One
we
step
can try to unravel it, one heart at a time, one person at a time.
starting right here.
Yep, starting with ourselves.
Yep.
And when can people expect that book/pamphlet or whatever you want to call it?
At the end of the year, the two smaller books will be out. 2026 in September will be the 30th anniversary of In Sheep's Clothing. So you can
Oh,
expect
wow.
a new book, new cover, new subtitle, very much updated with the vignettes being much more timely. Um, and and probably a new Judas syndrome also at the same time. So sometime in September 2026 for those, and the smaller books at the end of this year.
Okay. And then one last thing I wanted to ask you. I was going to ask you this before, but I had forgotten. Like recently for you, has there been anything you've updated your thinking on or anything you've changed your mind on recently?
Mm. Wow. I'm trying to think of any one thing. There's so many things. I mean, I changed kind of. I mean, I'm not dead yet, so I'm still growing and learning.
Good, good.
So let me think if I can pinpoint one that really stands out. Maybe maybe coming to understand that there are grains of truth in just about everything that we seem to pick at or debate or have divisions about, which is why we don't really talk to each other. There are grains of truth, some grains of truth, that in our own egos we don't want to acknowledge. It would be like given the other side too much power, and we're afraid of that. So one of the things that I've changed my thinking about, this is the big one, and it came as the result of my most recent baptism. And that's another program. But there's really nothing to fear. I now know, I don't just believe, I now know through a great grace and a really painful baptism,
Hmm.
that I'm an immortal soul having this experience. So there's really nothing to fear. And so all kinds of open, loving conversations are now possible that
Okay.
I didn't think were possible before because I'm not afraid.
I guess examining what people are afraid of, having that ego clash or their axioms be touched up against. I think that's really what it is.
Yeah, might have to change my thinking on something. Oh my God.
Right. Well, admitting they might be wrong,
Yeah.
admitting that
Oh my
there's
God.
something that they
Yeah.
have to update their thinking on. And that's one of the reasons I wanted to ask that question.
Well,
Because it can be tough. It can be tough for people sometimes
if you
to
really
do
love
that.
yourself, if you really love yourself in a healthy way, you're not afraid of that either.
I would agree. And that's why people need to strive or should be striving for that.
Yeah.
So, but leading by example, I think, is the way, one of the best ways to do that.
Yeah.
Right. To see, especially people that have influence, like people who have platforms, it's like, no, if they can see you admitting you were wrong or updating your thinking about things, you're setting the example. You're setting the tone.
Well, we'll have a live edition of Character Matters tomorrow on YouTube, and maybe that would be a great discussion point right there.
There you go. I would love it. I'll have to tune in for that. But so where can people find you? Where your YouTube channel is what?
Yeah, my YouTube channel, Dr. George Simon, and also my blog at drgeorgesimon.com. That's drgeorgesimon.com. And my books, of course, all available on Amazon.
Awesome. Well, I definitely appreciate you spending so much time with us all today, and everyone who watched. I know they appreciated it too.
Thank you, Jared. Always good to be with you.
Always good to be with you too, sir. Keep up the good work.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
So long.